What is going on, everyone? It's your boy Apollos, and I'm joined here today with Roy from Logos. Roy, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good.
Gotcha. Yeah, guys, I'm gonna be carrying most of the stream because Roy was actually debating a metaphysics mic not that long ago. So,
I had to
um,
get that video out quickly, so that's why I didn't have much time to prepare for this. I mean, it might
yeah,
be
you're good.
full of the debate.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, could you describe just a little bit of what that debate was like?
It was pretty fun. So it ended with him crashing out and basically kicking me. So he conceded that the Trinity, or at least the model that I gave, doesn't entail any contradictions. But then he's like, "Oh, but if the Trinity is logical, then it's true." I was like, "No, that's not what logical means." And then when I tried to explain it to him at the end, he just kicks me.
Nice. Well, yeah, today I was presenting at a mystery ETS EPS regional conference, so um, I think it went well. I was able to handle most of the questions and comments towards my paper. Hopefully, it gets published one of these days. But yeah, that was basically my last 2 days. Like you, I didn't prepare super much for this video that we're going to be reacting to. And for context, guys, it's gonna be a skeptical agnostics, how John the Baptist refutes Jesus' resurrection. Um, but yeah, I have some notes that I think dismantle pretty much his argument. Um, and yeah, like I guess we can go over like our general like comments about the video. Um, so I'll start right off. I think that he makes like several categorical errors to motivate his analogy, and once we expose those categorical errors, um, the analogy kind of falls apart. But what do you have to say about it, Roy? About like the summary of like the argument?
I think the argument is going to have to involve some form of a non sequitur, especially given the well. There's also like an equivocation done kind of on resurrection, because the claim, from what I know, isn't that John the Baptist was resurrected, but rather he was resuscitated, and that's going to come important when it comes to like. So, like, I guess you could say the context of this is that certain like scholars or apologists, maybe you want to point to someone like N.T. Wright, claimed that like the resurrection was unparalleled in the ancient world, and then they use this as like a piece of data to support the resurrection being true. And so this is one of the responses, but if this isn't really like a resurrection even being
One
talked about,
crucial
then oh, but if this isn't really a resurrection, because what people like Wright are talking about when they talk about resurrection is like its own unique category, and I think we're gonna get into that later.
Yeah, 100%. We're gonna get right into that. Um, Guys, remember to subscribe to Paul's Christian Apologetics. The videos that I'm most proud of are located in. Hold up, share this tab instead. Are located in my featured playlist. So I have things going over. Um, uh, like some really novel like things that I don't think a lot of apologists are talking about, like the Galilean crisis or understanding that low literacy rates doesn't entail like necessarily that the Gospels weren't eyewitnesses, and can actually be a motivator to uh, determine the probability of the Gospels being written by at least one eyewitness, aliens rising Jesus from the dead, and so on and so forth. But yeah, those are my featured videos. Yeah, here's Drew. I brought this up in my reply with what the crowd states in the Herod pericope. All we know is that some believed he was quote unquote raised. That's different from resurrection in an eschatological sense. Yeah, 100%, 100%. IP raid says user 81981. I'm guessing Rogan advertised my video in the IP Discord. Um, I don't know though, but yeah. Luke dated to 37 to 4180. Check it out on Apollo's Christian Apologetics. Yeah, 100%. Um, oh, yeah, it was Than actually who said raid my um live stream. Thanks, Than. IP raid. No, it was me. Gotcha.
That's nice. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Than. All right, let's go ahead and get started with this. Can you hear it, by the way?
Oh wait, do we want to cover each other's channels again since we probably got an influx? We can probably do it quickly then.
I think they can just replay it back.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. I think yeah, let's
Yeah,
get
for
into
sure.
this.
Yeah, for sure. Um, y'all are funny. Um,
Narrative in the Gospels neglected by skeptics is that of the story of John the Baptist. It's often taken for granted just how similar John's ministry was to that of Jesus's. In fact, their ministries were so similar that I believe that facts concerning John the Baptist, which are relayed in the Gospels, can be used to erect devastating arguments against belief in the
devastating.
resurrection of Jesus. So, in this video, we'll see how the story of John the Baptist, articulated in the Gospels themselves, can be used to refute arguments from Christian apologists that Jesus was raised from the dead.
So yeah, let's start off with the framing of this video. So first off, I just want to point out that the purpose of this video is not to dunk on skeptical agnostic too many times, even though I kind of have done that in the past before. I think he's a charitable interlocutor. Let's see, Haven, you and our IP server. Let's swap some notes. I hold to similar dating.
I think that's something else.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, I think
yeah.
this
That's an
is.
in-house discussion.
I think what he's kind of trying to say is that, from what I can tell, like, is this going to be an undercutting defeater or a rebutting defeater? Because from my interpretation, like I've seen this argument before, typically it's taken as an undercutting defeater, which is an issue because kind of the way that it's framed now is that it's a rebutting defeater. So I don't know. It seems like a shift from how it's used typically.
Yeah, and like I said, I think that what he does get right is that a lot of like the same audience for John the Baptist um, was like eventually became disciples of Jesus of Nazareth, and they use a lot of like similar verbiage when it comes to like their teachings, their apocalyptic teachings, quote unquote. Um, and like I said, I think there are a lot of categorical mistakes made when it comes to showing an apparent analogous relationship. Among these are things like it really comes across as like an afterthought or rumor, not a strong belief when it comes to identifying Jesus as John the Baptist raised from the dead. Um, and particularly, they're grounding it not because they actually saw John the Baptist raised from the dead, um, but because, like, as the text says, the powers are at work with Jesus. And we'll go more into detail about what this really means, but um, Roy needs to be louder. Okay, yeah. Let's see if you can edit mic settings. Uh,
Is that like
it looks like I can't. It looks like I can't on my end. But yeah.
uh,
Um,
I don't know. I can maybe try going closer. Is this better?
hopefully, yeah. But in any case, as I was saying, yeah. The transmigration of the souls is something like uh, John the Baptist's modern disciples hold to. So they hold to a view of the afterlife that doesn't include the resurrection from the dead, and this is probably what's going on over here when it comes to what is actually being said by the text. And we'll go more into detail about all that fancy stuff. But let's continue on with this video. Um, I just realized I wasn't sharing my slides when I was doing all that. But yeah, like this is his basic causal chain. Basically that uh there's a low epistemic threshold for things like the resurrection of Jesus and John being raised from the dead. Um, and he uses that to motivate his bereavement hallucination hypothesis, and therefore he has a naturalistic explanation for Christianity. Back to the stream. What do we know about John the Baptist, and who do we know it from? We have some passages not only just from the Bible, the biblical text and the Gospels, but we also have things from Josephus.
That's
Um,
about it. It's really just four sources usually that were drawn, or five sources. The Synoptic Gospels, which would be three sources, then John, then Josephus. Now, how you like number that specifically, whether you want to call it five or whatever, depends on like your views on, I guess you could say, the synoptic problem.
yeah, for sure. All right, now let's get back to the video. Here we go. Let's see. What's the next timestamp? It's 3:05. Excuse me.
Now, in that clip, Dr. Craig mentioned scholar N.T. Wright. And just to bolster Craig's claims here, N.T. Wright has stated, quote, "It would have been very natural for first century Jews, especially if they belonged to a kingdom of God movement already, to say of a leader who had paid the ultimate penalty at the hands of the authorities that his soul was in the hand of God, that he was alive to God, that he had been exalted to paradise. And if Jesus' followers had indeed had a sense that he was alive in a non-physical way, and even that he was still present with them in some fashion, this is how they would have expressed it. But in doing so, they would not have been saying that he had been raised from the dead, or that the resurrection of the dead had now occurred." Now, considering these sentiments by Dr. Craig and N.T. Wright and many apologists who follow suit, I think we can safely infer that they're blatantly incorrect. Not only are there major sociological holes in their arguments, but more importantly, and this is where we finally get to John the Baptist and his role in arguing against the resurrection, their arguments are contradicted by the gospel narratives themselves. For recall that in the gospels, John the Baptist had a ministry quite similar to Jesus's. In fact, there are many parallels between John's ministry and Jesus' ministry. John...
Alright, we'll stop it right there. Any thoughts on that immediately, Roy?
Yeah, this kind of gets into what they're talking about with resuscitation and resurrection. Though, like, this is something that, if I remember correctly, Wright does mention. There's examples of resuscitation or just reviving someone from the dead. But resurrection is its own category within, like, the Second Temple Jewish mindset. And that's what we were really concerned about when it comes to Jesus.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that have been pointed out by several scholars is that anastasis, which is uniquely, by and large, unique, almost exclusively in reference to a bodily or physical resurrection, namely within the Pharisaical understanding of the resurrection as a corporate, basically raising of the dead in physical immortal form. That's different from agero, over the word used for John the Baptist on the right, which can mean physical resurrection, but it has a broader semantic range to include things like even things like waking up from sleep or just getting up in general, restore to health, spiritual resurrection, and you can find references to these definitions in BDAG, Liddell Scott, plenty of like New Testament Greek lexicons, and so on and so forth. Some say Elijah. How does that fit in? I actually have slides going over this, but to spoil it a little bit, Elijah basically, in many Jewish traditions, was understood to be the forerunner to the Messiah, not necessarily like the initiator of the eschaton. And there are many, and it's explicitly in the Hebrew Bible that he never died. So, there are traditions that talk about like him being alive to this day, and things like that. And we'll get into that soon here in a bit. But yeah, like the taxonomy of the ancient afterlife, it was Herod the Great. No, sorry, not Herod the Great. Herod Antipas, who basically entertained this idea, according to Mark 6, that it was some sort of like a transmigration of the souls from John the Baptist into Jesus. And so like there's no understanding that it's radically different from Jesus' resurrection. One where there's anastasis, one where Jesus is raised immortally, and without corruption, and initiates the kingdom of God and things like that. Spiritual successor, but a spirit of John and Jesus. Yeah, pretty much that's what I would say. So let's see over here. But do you have anything to say on that, Roy, real quick?
Okay, my mind isn't working, my bad. But no, I think I would agree with you there.
Yeah, like it's more consistent with like a spiritual resurrection. The powers are at work with John. That doesn't seem to be what's implied by the text. It's him is likely the reference to Jesus, and the spiritual resurrection is more in line with this view than the anastasis, the apparent anastasis of John, the apparent resurrection of John. And like I said, like according to our Greek lexicons, like it was agero that was used to refer to John. Like Herod didn't think that Jesus was an immortal being possessed a glorified, incorruptible body shining like the stars, the hallmarks of the Jewish understanding of a resurrected being. No, he just simply believed that the powers at work with John are now at work with Jesus. So that seems to be a much more parsimonious and consistent uh, interpretation of the text. And we'll get a little bit more into, like the other alternatives of like the prophets of old and Elijah being ascribed to John the Baptist and kind of what was going on in the general rumors of the crowd. You wanted to say something, Roy?
Even if, let's say, Herod thought that Elijah, or sorry, not Elijah, that John the Baptist was like physically resuscitated from the dead, right? I'm not really sure why that would pose a defeater for the resurrection, because the conditions that would lead to Herod's belief are completely different from the conditions that lead to the disciples' beliefs, because the disciples' beliefs are going to be caused by like direct experience with Jesus and the experience of seeing him risen from the dead, whereas with Herod there's no implication of that. So there's a clear symmetry breaker between the two.
Yeah. I didn't put it in these slides, but there is an alternative hypothesis that interprets the text as saying that basically that uh, Jesus was practicing magic, and um, that was the explanation of like him being identified as John the Baptist, quote unquote, raised from the dead. Um, but yeah, I didn't put it in these slides. Someone Gmailed me a sheet pizza evidence for predestination. Yeah, maybe. Um, but yeah, like it doesn't make sense for Herod to say to someone like Jesus, a contemporary of John, a well-known contemporary of John the Baptist, um, to say that under the view that Jesus was John the Baptist anastasis, like resurrected in the immortal, like corporeal form that the Second Temple Jews by and large thought of. It's much more consistent with the transmigration of the souls theory. Um, and as we'll get into later, like that's what the Mandaeans, the successors to John the Baptist's disciples, believe. But yeah, um, yeah. Let's go on to the next clip that I have um, in this video. So hold on a second. 542. Do.
As Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 16 state, King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah, and others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. As Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 14 also state, now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. What we have here is very interesting indeed. John the Baptist is inferred to have been raised from the dead merely due to the fact that his ministry appears to have been, in some sense, reincarnated in Jesus' ministry. This fact...
Yeah, we'll stop right there. So, any immediate thoughts on that?
Well, I feel like we've kind of already gone into it a little bit, but I'll let you take that over from here.
Yeah, for sure. So I read a book by scholar Tucker S. Furta, proponent of the Galilean crisis, and we're not going to go into like necessarily like the various views of Jewish eschatology, but just in general, Elijah was understood to be like this intermediary figure that was still alive, that would like point out who the Messiah was. Because in 2 Kings 2, 1 through 12, he was caught up in the chariot. You know, that whole narration of like him and Elisha and the impartation of like his spirit and things like that. But we also see an example of like this tradition of Elijah existing on earth prior to the eschaton, within Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho 8:4. Other examples of Jewish speculation of prophets enjoying continuous afterlife, having never died, include prophets like Enoch, Moses, Jeremiah, Baruch, Ezra, Phineas, and Melchizedek. But we won't go too much into detail about all these figures. But the point that I did want to bring up is that within Jewish eschatology, especially with like the pox, like the general consensus of the crowd, that's what they are saying about John the Baptist. Not necessarily that the eschaton has literally begun, but he was like a reincarnated prophet, one of the prophets of old, is what the text says. So yeah, and as for Herod the Great, not Herod the Great, I keep confusing him. Herod Antipas. He was not a devout Jewish theologian. He was a Hellenized Roman client ruler, the Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, who had illicitly married Herodias, his brother's wife. And interestingly enough, his own father was paranoid, executing his own wife, mother-in-law, and 3 sons out of fear of a conspiracy to take his throne. And Herod Antipas, while more soft-spoken, likely inherited this fear. So yeah, like he comes from a direct lineage of like paranoid, like paranoia as far as like being
Subverted.
subverted, or like I guess you could say like being cursed having executed a holy man. And Josephus records that
Right, but with the disciples, that's not going to be the case. So that's kind of why we're saying that there's two different sets of like conditions that lead to these beliefs. So there's one set of conditions that lead to the belief that like John the Baptist was resuscitated, but then there's a completely different set of conditions that lead to the belief that Jesus was risen from the dead. And when it comes to the second set of conditions, that set of conditions is sufficient for having a rational belief, because the type of conditions going on there is that the disciples are having like multimodal experiences of Jesus after his death and resurrection, whereas with the former it's based off of paranoia.
yeah, for sure. Just finished my script on that very topic, priestly Melchizedek traditions in Hebrews. Nice. So there's that. And N.T. Wright himself, like who a skeptical agnostic was referencing, actually has some work on the risen John. So I'd also gesture towards that work as well. But yeah, let's go on to this next clip. I love Than Ryan Sweet. Let's see, 826.
Is one of social psychology. See, Christian apologists, like those we've already surveyed, like to assert that the social and religious paradigms of first century Palestine held such a high epistemic threshold regarding becoming convinced that someone had been raised from the dead. And yet we see from the Gospels themselves that the epistemic threshold was actually quite low. And we know from sociology that the collective psychology of a group, especially in relation to religious movements, is easily malleable in the face of circumstances that challenge existing frameworks, especially when the death of a revered religious figure is involved. We know of countless cases throughout history. One such case is that of Menahem Mendel Schneerson. Schneerson was a famous Hasidic rabbi, credited with significantly reviving the Hasidic Jewish dynasty, and is considered to be one of the most influential Jewish leaders of the 20th century. According to his most zealous followers, however, Schneerson was believed to be the Messiah, though Schneerson would distance himself from such proclamations. After his death in 1994, though, his followers continued to maintain belief that he was the Messiah, with many claiming that he was still alive, while others reported that they had indeed seen him alive after his supposed death. In fact, one quote from a Hasidic Jew after Schneerson's death reads, "I do not visit the Ohel, the tomb of Schneerson. I know the Rebbe is not there. He is still alive. I can feel his presence. Some Messianists visit the grave, but the Rebbe is not dead." Given examples like this, which again could be multiplied many times over throughout history, it's quite easy to see how a group of religious zealots in first century Palestine could innovate their religious framework and become convinced that a man rose from the dead merely by word of mouth. When a revered messianic leader...
Alright, we'll stop right there. One thing I forgot to point out in my last slide, it was basically the main conclusion we should draw regarding the whole Elijah situation. So... yeah, like I said earlier, many of Jesus' followers were in contact with John the Baptist's followers. In some cases, Jesus' followers were actually prior followers of John the Baptist, as is a tradition recorded in the Gospel of John. And as far as like in being in contact, you have that whole scene of like while John the Baptist is in prison, uh, his disciples ask on behalf of John the Baptist, should we look for someone else? So yeah, rumors or even visions of John the Baptist raising would not have initiated the eschaton, Elijah, or one of the prophets of old, because they never died to begin with. Therefore, transmigration of the souls is the best explanation of what is being said here, not Anastasis initiating the eschaton, even though you do have apocalypticism, situated in both John the Baptist and Jesus' ministry. But yeah, like I said, like we have the Mandaeans who at least claim to be the successors to John the Baptist's actual followers. And when you look at their sacred texts, they never claim that there was an empty tomb, or that they witnessed John the Baptist raised from the dead, or had any like sensory experiences that correspond to that belief. So yeah, like he says that fanciful hearsay can generate sincere belief, and I think that's a non sequitur. Or fanciful hearsay necessarily generates sincere belief. I think that's a non sequitur. Because like you see like, huh?
I was gonna say, even if we granted that in some sense, like some, I guess you could say, hearsay can generate, um, like actual belief of a resuscitation. That claim, that conditional, isn't going to entail anything about the resurrection. Because saying that fanciful hearsay can generate the sincere belief isn't going to
Yeah,
tell us whether it actually did, and it's not going to tell us anything about the
whether
fact
it
that
likely did.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I had to catch myself there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's like in some
But
sense, sure, we can like concede that very like specific conditional, but that conditional has no other entailments that are relevant to like the topic.
yeah. And also like in the contemporary literature that does talk about John the Baptist, like Acts of the Apostles, Paul indirectly talks about him through Apollos, which is where I get my YouTube name. Um, and also Josephus talks about it. Um, and they don't preserve anything like a resurrection tradition for John the Baptist. This is also not mutually exclusive to the resurrection hypothesis. John the Baptist being raised. Yeah, I would agree. Um, it's just that like the necessary and sufficient conditions to generate belief, in one sense over another sense are going to be different, for both John the Baptist and Jesus. So, let's see. I'm on slide 10. Okay. Um, yeah, these are just some sources that talk about the Mandaean views of the afterlife. Um, and yeah, so and these are like the comparative symmetry breakers between the followers of Jesus, versus John the Baptist. Um, like also Herod thinks that Jesus is John raised, not that John is now raised. He knows it's another person. Yeah, exactly. Which is what I was trying to point out with the reference of the pronoun in that verse, most likely referring to Jesus. Um, so there's that. Um, okay, looks like I got the next timestamp up here. So, we'll remove this and we'll put this on.
Dies, the lowered psychological threshold required to subvert the cognitive dissonance of the movement's adherents can quite easily lead to religious innovations that posit that the leader is in some sense still alive. However, apologists will still attempt to discount stories such as these. After all, the case of Rabbi Schneerson is not identical to the case of John the Baptist, for John the Baptist and Schneerson lived in completely disparate cultures in separate social paradigms. Isn't this a case of comparing first century apples with 20th century oranges? Now, of course, this is somewhat true, but it's trivially true. No one is claiming that any specific case is completely identical to the case of John the Baptist. Even Jesus' story, though it shares striking parallels with John the Baptist's ministry, does not entertain a one-to-one correspondence with John's. But what is similar and where the parallels are important is the way in which social psychological factors and phenomena take hold in religious demographics. These phenomena.
Yeah, and I have a big issue with the way skeptical agnostic tries to draw that analogy, because yeah, like on one hand, like when it comes to like the messianism of like that of the cognitive dissonance of like that modern Jewish spiritual group. That's easily explainable under the cognitive dissonance theory, but if you were to take the Gospels as reliable, you have things like polymodal experiences to groups, to skeptics. There's an empty tomb. Um, did he just say, "Let me explain why I'm going to cherry pick information"? Um,
I think he's making a joke, but yeah,
yeah,
I feel like this doesn't really hurt like a maximalist case. At most, this can go against, let's say, like a minimalist case, but I don't know. Even then, I feel like it doesn't really hurt it that much because the argument that someone like Wright is making or that Craig wants to make is that a claim about resurrection is not going to be expected. Not just mere resuscitation, but rather resurrection from the disciples specifically. Like maybe Herod might have anticipated some resuscitation because of his paranoia, but what does that actually tell us about like the psychological state of the disciples? I don't really see why it would tell us anything.
yeah, for sure. Um, and I have one more timestamp after this. It's the one on 15. Hold up, did I go over those slides? No, I didn't. Yeah, let me pull those up here real quick. So let me go over this one. Yeah, this is just basically the same thing. You know, in one sense, like for that modern Jewish movement, like the claim of spiritual is a claim of spiritual presence, but there's no claim of a physically empty grave or that he was resuscitated into immortality. Um, but yeah, let's go on to this next clip, this last clip.
Phenomena do significantly overlap between.
Oh, whoops, that's the wrong one. 1458.
Including the final resurrection. This entails believing that Jesus has risen from the dead was not a difficult deduction to make for a first century Jew. We see Paul clearly make this inference in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20, when he states that, quote, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep," end quote. So Jesus was seen as the, quote, first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The final resurrection was expected any moment, and Jesus was merely the catalyst of this eschatological event. We also see that this is likely what the writer of Matthew's gospel was alluding to when he narrates the odd occurrence in Matthew 27 of many saints being raised and exiting their tombs after Jesus' resurrection. Matthew was likely attempting to demonstrate that Jesus' resurrection was the first fruits of.
Yeah. So my problem with this is that those aren't like resurrections into immortality. Those are just resuscitations. So yeah, let me go ahead and share my screen over here real quick. So wait, how does that verse prove the second coming was supposed to come earlier? I don't know, man. I don't know. But yeah, as far as like different views of eschatology, like you can either take like Christopher Hayes and Mike Jones' conditional eschatology view, or you can take my view, which is called the Galilean crisis. The problem is that if you're going to use cognitive dissonance to motivate, you know, basically why there's a claim going around that John the Baptist was apparently raised from the dead, and that likely refers to spiritual resurrection. You know, John the Baptist doubted towards the end of his life whether or not Jesus was the Messiah. And as for the Matthew raising of the saints, there's no indication that these were eschatological resurrections, anastasis, into glorious incorruptible bodies, but just a few temporary resuscitations for these saints to die again. And we have an implication of basically these people who were raised by Jesus having to die again in Irenaeus in his against heresies. And I believe there's another church father, but I couldn't find him, that mentions basically these resuscitations. So yeah, the rumor threshold, claiming a living miracle worker is empowered by a dead martyr's ghost, requires zero empirical evidence. It thrives on low threshold hearsay. claiming an individual physically resurrected in the middle of history, leaving an empty tomb in the shadow of their execution site, requires a massive empirical catalyst. Um, and so N.T. Wright's axiom still holds. Um, so yeah, I at the end of the day, I think it's just like a mountain made out of a molehill trying to match a mountain of evidence. Um, so yeah, that pretty much sums up most of it. Um, he didn't seem to understand what first fruits means, but he was close. Jesus isn't the first, but the first fruits, and there is a difference. It's not about it's about harvest, not a single pluck to taste. Um, that's an interesting reading. I'll have to look more into that. Um, but yeah, that's the last slide I have for this. So basically, to summarize, like there's really good reason to interpret that passage not referring to um, uh, John the Baptist's disciples witnessing a physical resurrection into immortality. Um, Cognitive dissonance wouldn't um, wouldn't be a good predictor for that, and that's probably what's not being interpreted. That's probably not the best interpretation of that text. Um, in terms of like what the best interpretation is, it's probably cognitive dissonance is motivating him to say that he was, raised spiritually with a transmigration of the souls in some sense, but it's not a defeater to the epistemic threshold to say that Jesus was physically raised from the dead into immortality, and the disciples witnessed it and things like that. So that's basically how I would summarize this argument. But yeah, man, I honestly, dude, I've just been tired from giving my presentation at ETS or EPS, so that's why this stream was relatively short. But um, yeah, any final thoughts, Roy, on that video?
No, I think I agree with the overall like assessment you've given and what I've given. I think that there's going to be like a clear symmetry breaker between the two scenarios.
Yeah, for sure. Wow, this stream went really quick. Um,
I mean, the video
but
isn't that long, so.
yeah, okay, guys, I guess I'll end it off here. So, Lone
I guess.
apologist, didn't you also cook him on paraconsistent logic?
Yeah, you might
Yeah,
want to bring that comment
yeah,
up.
for
So
sure.
after I talked to him, he was doing like an open panel, and this guy, Clueless, went up or Lamb Apologetics. He went up on there to talk about paraconsistent logic, and Mike just ended up dropping him because well, he was Clueless. I can't. Well, okay, I should clarify. Clueless is his like name on Discord, but then like Lamb is his name on YouTube. But I can't lie, Lamb was kind of knowledge capping him.
For sure, for sure. All right. And with that, thank you guys for joining. Thank you guys for listening to me ramble on um cover something else. Um yeah, I definitely plan to like cover other things. Or maybe he was referring to you. What do you think this is referring to, Roy?
Cover something. Maybe I don't know. Fan, what are you talking about? Maybe I don't know. He wants us to like stream about another topic. I don't know.
Hmm. But yeah, you have me on Discord, Than. And yeah, we'll just end it off right here. This is your boy Paul signing out. Peace.
No.
Cancel. Oh, whoops, that's leave studio. Don't end the stream, do more.
Oh,
Um
about what, Fan?
Gotta listen to Papa Than when he speaks.
I guess, bro.
Yeah. But let's see. Did I go over everything in my notes? I think I did. Um, Oh, the mic stream. Yeah, we could do that, and I can just like retitle the
Uh, what?
like
Okay.
the
Oh,
stream.
did he DM you that?
It's this one, right? Hold up.
Oh, so
Uh,
oh no, he said he was joking. I mean, we can cover it briefly. Yeah, so this one was pretty funny. So it starts
gotcha.
off kind of, I guess, to kind of summarize what happens. So I come up there, I interpret the panel about like whether or not the Trinity, or I interpret the topic as being like whether or not there's going to be a contradiction within the Trinity. And so typically, whenever you say that a set of statements is illogical, what you're saying is that that set of statements is going to entail a contradiction, meaning that like no way of modeling that statements is going to end up with a consistent model. And so I came up there, I interpreted that way. He was like, "Yeah, that's what I want to talk about." Because I said, "Oh, so you want to talk about like the logicality or consistency of the Trinity?" And he's like, "Yeah, that's exactly what I want to talk about." And so I gave him the model of the Trinity given by, or I guess you could say that it's a model of the Trinity given by Bo Branson, where he's trying to represent kind of what Gregory of Nyssa says about the Trinity. And he basically just concedes that, yeah, there's not any contradiction there. And then he tries to basically move the topic from being about the consistency of the Trinity to like, oh, can you justify the metaphysics of the Trinity? Like, what is what is justifying the metaphysics of the Trinity have to do with this?
Yeah. I guess I'll play to the end, right before we end the stream, because I do want to see like how. Um,
There's so
oh,
I
okay,
should
it's
explain.
over
There's
here.
more than the debate because like he kicks me off and then he starts rambling about like apparently how I'm uninformed or whatever, and he just makes a bunch of straw man. So I take some time to respond to it. But the actual debate itself was like I think 25 minutes because he kicks me off after I say that. So like he says, you know what? I agree that the Trinity is going to be formally consistent, but it's not going to be logical in the sense that it's true. And I'm like, no, the ordinary sense of the word logical just means that it's consistent. So you already conceded the debate.
Hmm. Let's see.
Okay, once again, these are just theological or metaphysical questions. They have literally nothing to do with the topic. I have no burden to answer the questions there.
Okay,
If you want to ask questions about the logical nature of the model, I'm like, go ahead, but this has nothing to do with the topic.
All right, so Roy, correct me here if I'm wrong, but did you not say earlier that, well, metaphysics, Mike, since you conceded that it's formally logical, we can move on to the metaphysics? Did you not say that? You know I'm going to
No, I said we could move on to your definitions of like what exactly you mean by informal logic. Because you seem to have this view of informal logic in which something is going to be logical according to informal logic if it's true, meaning that it's a true set of propositions. But
Okay,
I don't
okay.
agree with that definition.
Okay, so listen, man, I have already told you that you can formalize the Trinity in a way that is logical in a strict formal sense. Do I need to say this like 8 other times? You get to
Yeah, I understand that.
Okay, so then let's get to informal logic. Let's get to the metaphysics.
So pause it right there.
Yeah.
Right? So he just says, yeah, you
It's
can
crashing out a
formalize
little
the-
bit.
Yeah, you can formalize the Trinity in a way that's logical. Okay, so then there's a model of the Trinity which does not entail a contradiction, meaning there's no there's no logical problem of the Trinity anymore. So you just conceded that it's wrong. Remember, right? The LPT, the whole point of it is kind of to show that there's no way of modeling the statements. There's one God, the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God, without entailing some contradiction or without entailing tritheism or modalism. Because the idea is that that set of statements is either going to entail that there's a contradiction and that there's three gods, or it's going to entail that those three persons are actually one person, which would be another contradiction with a Trinitarian view, right? So by conceding that there's no consistency, I'm sorry, by conceding that there's no inconsistency, he's just conceding that there's no logical problem.
For sure, for sure. Let's see how this ends.
Because that's the truth value.
I want to see the kick.
Look, I don't think you're getting my point. I'm saying that by conceding that it's going to be like formally consistent, you're just conceding that it's logical. That's going to be the same thing because that's what logical means.
Okay,
Like,
so
logical
listen,
means binding by the-
brother, you keep saying that without the qualifier. It is logical in a strict formal sense. Hello, we keep saying this. We keep going.
No, saying something is logical.
Yeah, all right,
like,
all right, brother,
you have to just-
See, hold on,
All
hold
right,
on.
goodbye.
Look, I try to
He said
I try
goodbye.
to- like he makes a point. I try to contest the point, right? Notice how he pauses after he makes the point, and I say, "Okay, no, this is why you're wrong," and he just kicks me right after. Like W running, bro. W running.
Yeah, you should definitely change your title to Metaphysics runs from Roy is a Trinity logical. Yeah,
He said, "Okay." Someone in the chat says 3 is 1 is a clear contradiction. Yeah, what's
That's
gonna be
right.
like argument there? Yeah, no, this is someone. I think this is the Rembrandt guy that came up above.
Oh, so he's serious. No, yeah, I remember this dude. I remember this
I
dude.
remember this dude. I remember this dude. Gang, when we say
Yeah.
God is one and that God is triune, we don't mean that literally God, we're not saying God is one and God is three in the same sense. God is going to be one substance or one essence. God is going to be three persons. So that's not in the same sense. So there's no contradictions.
For sure. But yeah, I gesture towards Roy's video on Imago Logo, so guys, check that out. Please support him as you support me. He's been really helpful for helping me put some content out there, continuing to motivate me and stuff like that. But yeah, I guess we'll see you all in the next one, unless anyone has any outstanding requests. But yeah, we'll end the stream right there. You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider becoming a Patreon member for Apollo's Christian Apologetics. Your partnership helps with creating original Christian apologetics research, gets you exclusive access to videos, and more. Want to catch me personally online? Well, feel free to join our Discord server. But in any case, Christianity is true, apologetics is base. This is your boy Apollo signing out. Peace.